I'm Callie, I'm 28, and my grandfather, someone I spent every day with for the past 2 years, just passed away. I thought I was the one who truly cared for him, who stayed by his side when no one else did. But today, at his will reading, they all looked at me like I was the villain. They called me a thief in front of everyone. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family drama and emotional courage. The air in the lawyer's office felt thick, almost suffocating. The faint smell of old paper, polished wood, and a hint of coffee barely masked the tension humming like an invisible wire. I walked through the door clutching my purse, trying to stay composed. But the second I stepped in, I knew something was off. Eyes turned toward me. The silence was loud, heavy. Callie, my aunt's voice rang out, sharper than I expected, cutting through the quiet like a knife. You've been stealing from him, haven't you? The words hit me before I could even breathe. I froze in place, gripping my purse strap like it was the only thing anchoring me to reality. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. The room suddenly felt too small. The chairs too close. The walls seemed to press in. My mind whirled, trying to process what I had just heard. Stealing? From my grandfather? The man I had spent countless nights caring for, sitting beside his bed when he couldn't sleep, helping him with every tiny task he struggled with in his final months. My throat tightened, my stomach twisted. This accusation wasn't just unfair, it was impossible. Yet here it was, thrown at me in front of the people I had grown up thinking were my family. Other relatives murmured, some nodding subtly, some leaning closer as if to catch every word. I could see the mix of shock, curiosity, and barely disguised smugness on their faces. A few whispered to each other, glances exchanged like a secret agreement. I felt entirely alone, though I knew I shouldn't have been surprised. Family gatherings often carried quiet judgments. But this was something else, a public, humiliating accusation aimed at the one person who had actually been there for our grandfather when it mattered most. I don't know what you mean. I managed, my voice trembling slightly despite my effort to remain calm. I haven't taken anything from him. You have to believe me. Silence followed my words, heavier than the accusation itself. The lawyer, a calm but firm woman named Ms. Hargrove, cleared her throat, though her eyes flicked briefly toward my aunt, who seemed almost smug in her triumph. Let's remember, Ms. Hargrove said evenly, accusations without proof are not evidence. We'll review the will and the instructions my grandfather left, but we must remain professional. Professional. The word sounded hollow in the midst of such raw emotion. Every step I had taken for the past 2 years, the countless meals prepared, the endless nights spent keeping him company, the appointments I attended for him when no one else could, suddenly felt invisible. I was invisible, and now I was a target. My chest tightened as I tried to steady my breathing. I could feel tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back. I refused to cry here, not in front of the people who had already decided I was guilty. Yet I couldn't stop my mind from replaying small moments, tiny instances where family members had subtly undermined me, ignored my grandfather's needs, or made comments about me taking advantage of his generosity. At the time, I had brushed it off. I had thought they were harmless. I had been wrong. The accusation didn't just sting, it sparked a wave of anger. Not a loud, shouting anger, but a deep, simmering one, the kind that made your jaw ache and your fists clench without thought. I could feel it bubbling inside me as my aunt leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms like she had won some invisible battle. You've been alone with him, my uncle added, his voice low but sharp, almost a whisper that carried just enough for everyone in the room to hear. You were always there, Callie, always around. And now, suddenly, things are missing? The room seemed to close in further. I could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as someone shifted in their seat, the scratch of a pen on a legal pad as Ms. Hargrove jotted notes, the soft murmur of another relative muttering agreement. My pulse raced. My hands shook. I wanted to scream, to tell them exactly what I thought, to demand they think before they spoke, but the words wouldn't come. My throat felt raw, like swallowing broken glass. I forced myself to remember something important, the truth. My grandfather had always been careful, even paranoid about his money. He had noticed small amounts disappearing here and there, and had quietly installed a security camera in the living room months before his passing. At the time, I had thought it unnecessary, almost comical. Now, it felt like a lifeline, a thread connecting me to the evidence I desperately needed. But I couldn't reveal that yet, not until I saw how deep this accusation ran. I had to watch, to observe. My eyes scanned the room, taking in every smirk, every subtle glance, every whispered comment. My cousin Lily sat silently in the corner, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes wide as she avoided looking at me directly. My aunt's lips curled into the faintest, almost imperceptible smirk. The room wasn't just judging me, it was strategizing. They were trying to make me flinch, to break me. I could feel my grandfather's presence in my mind, though he was gone. I remembered his quiet instructions, the stories he told me about patience, about loyalty, about standing firm even when the world assumed the worst. I had lived by those lessons for the past 2 years, and I would not abandon them now, no matter how loud the accusations became. "You have no proof," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "I've never stolen anything from him. I stayed with him, cared for him, and helped him every day. If you think otherwise, then you're looking in the wrong place." My aunt laughed, a short, sharp sound that made my skin crawl. "Proof? You don't need proof. Everyone knows the type. You care too much about appearances, Callie. You wanted him alone. You wanted him to trust you. And now, here we are." I swallowed, keeping my composure. I refused to react with anger. My grandfather would have hated that. Instead, I let silence be my armor, letting their words hang in the air and reveal their own intentions. The lawyer cleared her throat again. "Let's remember why we're here," she said, her voice firm but neutral. "We will read the will and follow the legal instructions. Accusations without evidence have no weight. Let's proceed in order." But order felt impossible. The room buzzed with quiet tension, like a live wire stretched too tight. Every glance, every murmur felt like a knife slicing at me. I could feel the heat rising in my face, my ears burning with shame and frustration, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. The unfairness of it all was suffocating. I shifted in my seat, trying to ground myself. I reminded myself of the countless times I had sat beside my grandfather's bed, listening to him talk about his life, his regrets, and his small joys. I had been there when no one else had cared, and I knew the truth of my actions. That knowledge was my shield, and it would have to carry me through this storm. As the lawyer began to call names for the reading, I felt a strange mixture of dread and determination. Every passing second stretched the tension tighter. I could see my relatives leaning forward, waiting for me to falter, to show weakness, to break under the weight of their collective judgment. But I refused. I recalled a particular moment from the previous week, my grandfather's faint smile as I helped him arrange his papers, the soft pat on my hand, the whispered, "Thank you, Callie." That small gesture reminded me why I had stayed, why I had persevered through exhaustion, and why I would not allow these baseless accusations to define me. The room remained charged, every sound amplified, the creak of a chair, the faint shuffle of papers, the distant hum of an air vent. My mind raced, plotting, calculating, remembering every detail, every act of kindness I had performed, every silent evening spent by his side. All of it contrasted sharply with the cold accusations now being hurled at me, and I clung to that contrast as a lifeline. Even as the whispers continued, even as the stares bored into me, like icy daggers, I felt a slow, steady resolve forming. They could call me a thief, they could question my integrity, but they could not rewrite the months of loyalty, care, and love that I had given. And somewhere, the truth, silent, patient, and waiting, would speak louder than their voices ever could. By the time the first reading began, I was prepared, not with anger, not with shouting, not with tears, but with quiet certainty. I would not be broken here. I would not be defined by their accusations. The room might have shattered around me, but I was still whole, still grounded in what truly mattered, the truth of my actions and the silent proof that waited to be revealed. When the first reading began, I sat in my chair, shoulders straight, hands folded in my lap. The room seemed quieter now, but only in the sense that all eyes were on me, silently daring me to flinch. I thought back to the months that had brought me here, the small, often overlooked moments that had defined my life as my grandfather's caregiver. No one had ever called attention to them, yet each one had been a lifeline for him. And I realized now, a lifeline for me as well. It hadn't been glamorous, not even close. Some days I felt like a ghost wandering through his modest, slightly worn house. The linoleum in the kitchen was scratched from years of use, and the faint smell of old books and polished would always linger in the living room. I had spent countless hours there, scrubbing, organizing, and making the place livable, while my relatives ignored the space entirely. I remembered the first week after he moved back from the hospital, how the sunlight caught the dust motes floating lazily in the air. I had spent an entire morning wiping down the shelves, vacuuming the corners, and arranging his favorite chairs so he could sit and watch the street without bumping into anything. My grandfather never asked for much. His pride was stronger than anyone I knew, which made my work almost invisible. He insisted on doing small tasks himself, though he couldn't always manage. Sometimes he would lift a jar from the counter and struggle with it, and I would reach out, my hand hovering for a moment before offering assistance. He would shake his head, muttering, "I've got it, Callie." But I knew better, and when he finally gave in, the quiet gratitude in his eyes was enough to keep me going. Some days felt endless. I would arrive early making breakfast and coffee exactly the way he liked it, light cream in the coffee, eggs scrambled just until the whites were firm, but the yolks still soft. I could hear him shuffling to the kitchen, cane tapping lightly on the tile, and I would try to smile without letting the exhaustion show. Those mornings were quiet, punctuated by small talk, stories about his youth, and the occasional joke that made him laugh so quietly I almost missed it. I would fold laundry, tidy his medications, and set his pills in little trays, always making sure nothing was out of place. No one else seemed to notice or care. Relatives would come by sporadically, often late in the day, when it was convenient for them, glancing around with barely a word of thanks. They would chat briefly, comment on how nice everything looked, then leaving me to handle the real work of cleaning up, cooking, or even sitting quietly with him during his moments of sadness. There were nights when I stayed up simply because he needed company. He hated being alone, especially after his surgeries and the long stretches of recovery. I would sit in the armchair across from his bed, watching him breathe, listening to the faint tick of the old clock on the wall, and wondering how I had ended up in this strange, invisible role. I wasn't paid for my time. I wasn't praised. I wasn't even really acknowledged. But there was a quiet fulfillment in knowing that someone had to be there, and I was the only one willing to stay. I remembered one night in particular. It had been storming outside, rain lashing against the windows, wind rattling the blinds. He had woken in the middle of the night, confused and frightened. I went to him immediately, speaking softly, guiding him to the chair beside his bed, wrapping a blanket around his frail shoulders. He clutched my hand for a moment, and I held on tightly, not saying much because words felt hollow in that moment. It was just us, the storm outside, and the shared silence that spoke louder than anything else. Those nights, I realized, were the moments that truly mattered. Even during the day, the routine was filled with small, unnoticed acts. I would refill the water pitcher, make sure his favorite chair was warm and comfortable, or help him navigate the steps to the garden so he could enjoy the sun. I learned which pills made him drowsy and which ones kept him alert. I learned how he liked his meals seasoned, when he preferred tea instead of coffee, and which stories of his past would lift his spirits. Each act, though small, was a thread in the tapestry of care I wove for him every single day. And yet, in the eyes of my family, none of that mattered. I was just the child who seemed too close, too helpful, too involved. They never saw the patience required to spend an hour helping him put on a shirt when his hands shook violently. They never saw the meticulous planning it took to balance his medical appointments with my own job and errands. They didn't notice the worry that gnawed at me whenever he took a step without me nearby, the fear that one misstep could result in something irreparable. I carried all of that silently. Sometimes I questioned why I continued. The lack of recognition stung, and I often felt invisible. Friends would ask how I was, and I would smile and say, "Fine, everything's fine," while inside, exhaustion and frustration churned. I had no room to complain, no opportunity to vent, because my grandfather's needs always came first. And still, I stayed. There were minor conflicts that no one else noticed, small tests of patience that gradually shaped me. I remembered the day the mail arrived late, a stack of unpaid bills tucked into the mailbox. My grandfather had been anxious, worried about missing payments, and I had spent hours on the phone negotiating with different offices, explaining his situation. By the time I hung up, I was drained, but he was calm, reassured, and able to sleep that night. No one had seen me handle the crisis. No one had noticed. And then there were the subtle betrayals. A cousin would stop by, glance at the neatly arranged medications, and comment that I was too attentive or paranoid, as if my care was somehow suspicious. My aunt once remarked casually, "I don't know why you do so much for him. Callie, it's just money after all. He'll leave it to someone eventually." The words had stung then, but they stung harder now, as I sat in that lawyer's office while they accused me of stealing. I remembered a specific moment when he had handed me a small envelope, folded neatly, and placed it gently in my palm. He whispered, "Callie, I trust you. That's all that matters." My heart had swelled with quiet pride that day, knowing that his trust meant more than any family argument, more than any inheritance. But now, even that trust was being questioned, as if it were meaningless in the face of loud accusations. I had also learned to read his moods, understanding when he needed space and when he needed company. Some days he was irritable, snapping over minor inconveniences, yet I never complained. I learned to approach him calmly, speaking in measured tones, guiding him gently through moments of confusion. And other days, when he was cheerful and lively, I shared in his joy, laughing quietly at his stories about the old neighborhood or his college days. No one else witnessed these small victories, but they mattered. They shaped the person I became in those 2 years. The kitchen, where I spent so many hours, felt like a sacred space. I remembered the first time I cooked a full breakfast for him after his surgery, scrambled eggs, toast, and his favorite oatmeal. He had smiled faintly, eyes soft, and whispered, "You've got a gift for this, Callie." I had laughed, thinking it was nothing, but it was one of the few moments he had openly appreciated my effort. I stored that memory carefully, a token of validation I could carry even when others ignored me. Every mundane act became infused with care and meaning. Folding laundry, arranging flowers, watering plants, ensuring his slippers were always within reach. These small, repetitive gestures created stability in his life, stability he could no longer provide for himself. And though the rest of the family seemed indifferent, I knew their absence had made my presence even more crucial. I had stepped into a role they refused to see. Even grocery runs carried their own challenges. I learned to plan meticulously, remembering what he liked and disliked, checking expiration dates carefully, and pacing each trip to avoid tiring him. One afternoon, a sudden rainstorm drenched me as I returned from the store, and he had chuckled softly, pulling me inside and handing me a towel. "You always think of everything," he said, a quiet acknowledgement that no one else offered. That acknowledgement, simple as it was, carried more weight than any conversation I could have with my family. At night, I often sat beside his bed, holding his hand as he fell asleep. I remembered the day he confessed his fears about dying alone, his voice shaky and hesitant. I listened, offering words of comfort that felt too small for the weight of his worries. In those moments, he confided in me, trusting me with his vulnerabilities. I was invisible to everyone else, but not to him. And it was in that invisibility that I found strength. No praise, no recognition, no applause, just the quiet knowledge that I had been needed and had responded. My commitment had never been about validation. It had been about presence. Every small, unacknowledged act had been a thread in a tapestry of care I had woven for him. Now, as I sat in the lawyer's office, facing accusations and judgment, I realized that those threads were unbroken. They had shaped who I was and had prepared me for this moment. The invisibility I had once resented had forged a resilience I could not have imagined. I would not flinch. I would not bow to false accusations. I had been a caregiver. I had been present. And in the end, that truth could not be taken from me. As the initial shock of the accusation began to settle, a subtle shift in the room became impossible to ignore. It wasn't loud or immediate. It was quieter, like a barely audible tremor beneath the polished veneer of the lawyer's office. Soft murmurs, glances exchanged behind folded hands, the faint movement of chairs scraping against the floor. Every little sound carried a hidden meaning. My senses, already sharpened from months of caregiving, picked up each tiny cue. This was no longer just a room of shocked relatives. It was a battlefield, and every whispered word carried the weight of strategy and suspicion. I noticed my uncle, Mr. Thompson, sitting to my left, leaning slightly forward with one hand braced against the armrest. His eyes were narrowed, scanning the room like a hawk measuring potential threats. Every now and then, he would glance at me briefly, then quickly shift his gaze elsewhere, as if he were carefully considering what to say next. There was a calculation in his posture, a subtle effort to intimidate without speaking. My pulse quickened, not out of fear, but out of awareness that I was walking into a game I hadn't asked to play. On the other side of the room, my cousin Jason whispered something to my aunt, his words inaudible to me, but clearly strategic. They leaned in close to one another, smiles barely restrained, a kind of quiet confidence that made my stomach twist. Every so often, they would glance at me, their eyes brimming with an almost gleeful anticipation. They expected me to falter. They expected me to crumble under their scrutiny. And yet, I refused to give them that satisfaction. I reminded myself to breathe. Slowly, deliberately, in and out. I needed to stay grounded, even as the room's tension pressed in from all sides. I had spent months caring for my grandfather, anticipating his needs, managing his health, and navigating challenges that required patience most people couldn't imagine. This situation while different, required similar focus. I had to observe, understand, and wait. Every whisper was a piece of a puzzle, every hidden agenda a key to understanding who truly wanted to manipulate the narrative. The lawyer, Ms. Hargrove, continued with the formalities, her calm voice creating a fragile balance in the room. She reminded everyone to speak clearly, to maintain decorum, and to avoid direct confrontations. But her words barely penetrated the charged atmosphere. My family's subtle machinations continued, layered beneath polite nods and neutral expressions. It was exhausting just to witness, and yet I felt an odd thrill, an acute awareness that the truth, though buried, would eventually emerge. A small but telling moment occurred when my cousin Lily, usually quiet and reserved, shifted in her chair. Her fingers drummed nervously against the armrest, her eyes darting toward my aunt before flicking back to me. I realized she was caught between loyalty and fear, unsure whether to side with the dominant voices in the room or to remain neutral. Her subtle hesitation spoke volumes. She wasn't complicit, not entirely, but she also wasn't brave enough to intervene. That tiny detail, unnoticed by everyone else, was the first thread I noticed in the web of hidden agendas surrounding me. I took a deep breath and reminded myself of the countless times I had navigated similar tension while caring for my grandfather. There were mornings when he would wake in the middle of a storm, trembling with confusion and fear, and I had to guide him back to bed without alarming him further. There were evenings when he would insist he was fine despite visible pain, and I had to insist gently that he take his medication. Those small acts of management, negotiation, and diplomacy had trained me well for this moment. I had learned to read people, to anticipate reactions, and to remain composed even when surrounded by hostility. As the will reading progressed, my aunt continued her subtle campaign, leaning slightly toward my uncle, whispering occasionally, her voice low and careful. Every word seemed designed to poison the room against me without ever uttering an accusation aloud. I caught snippets. She's too close. We can't trust her. He probably left it to her because she manipulated him. Each phrase, though soft, carried heavy implications, shaping the perceptions of those around her. I had no doubt that these whispers had been carefully planned in advance, a coordinated attempt to make me appear guilty without any concrete proof. Meanwhile, my uncle continued his quiet intimidation. At one point, he cleared his throat in a way that drew everyone's attention, then let out a slow, deliberate sigh. "Well, I suppose we should remember," he said, carefully neutral, "that appearances can be misleading. We must all stay vigilant, especially when large sums of money are involved." The statement was technically innocuous, but I understood its true meaning. It was a veiled suggestion that I was untrustworthy. I felt the weight of the room pressing down on me, the collective judgment of everyone assembled, and I silently reminded myself that composure was my only weapon. Small, almost invisible gestures became significant in this environment. My aunt lightly tapped her pen against the table whenever I spoke, an unconscious yet pointed attempt to show impatience. My cousin Jason shifted his chair closer to my uncle, their bodies forming a subtle alliance designed to isolate me. Even the way my grandmother adjusted her scarf, eyes flicking toward me briefly before looking away, seemed like a silent evaluation. Every motion, every glance carried unspoken meaning. I realized that I was no longer just defending myself against accusations. I was reading a room filled with strategy, manipulation, and careful misdirection. In the midst of it all, I noticed the impact of silence. Whenever someone paused before speaking, leaning toward another in a whisper, the tension thickened. A single word, delivered with just enough inflection, could sway opinion. One phrase, one laugh, one subtle nod could be interpreted as an endorsement or condemnation. I found myself noting these tiny moments like a detective, cataloging behavior and predicting what might come next. My grandfather had taught me to notice details, how a slight hesitation could reveal honesty or deception, and now those lessons applied in a new and uncomfortable way. A moment of particular tension arrived when my cousin Jason leaned forward suddenly, voice lowered just enough to be audible only to my aunt and uncle. "Do you think she really deserves it?" he asked, his words dripping with mock concern. My aunt's eyes flicked toward me, sharp and calculating, before she offered a faint, tight smile. The exchange, though subtle, was a clear attempt to frame me as undeserving in front of anyone watching closely. I suppressed the urge to respond verbally, knowing that any outburst would only play into their narrative. Instead, I let silence speak, allowing the weight of their own deceit to linger in the air. Even my grandmother, who often maintained neutrality, seemed caught in the web. Her eyes, usually warm and patient, now flitted between my aunt and me, uncertainty flickering briefly. I realized she was grappling with loyalty, memory, and her own desire to avoid confrontation. She had witnessed my dedication firsthand, yet the whispers and subtle alliances in the room made her hesitate. That hesitation became another layer of tension, a reminder that influence in this room was as much about perception as it was about reality. Throughout it all, I relied on the mental techniques that had kept me calm during caregiving. I focused on breathing, visualized clear pathways for thought, and reminded myself of my grandfather's trust in me. I knew that truth would eventually surface, but first I had to navigate these hidden agendas with precision, observing carefully, noting alliances, and understanding the motives behind every glance and whisper. A minor yet telling incident occurred when a family friend, Mrs. Campbell, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward and whispered something to my aunt. The words were inaudible, but the reaction was immediate. My aunt's smile shifted ever so slightly, and she nodded as if receiving confirmation of some plan. This small exchange, invisible to the rest of the room, underscored the network of influence working against me. I realized that it wasn't just my immediate family orchestrating a narrative. There were external actors reinforcing the same hidden agenda. The tension reached a subtle crescendo when the lawyer asked a procedural question about verifying certain documents. The response from my relatives, though polite, was layered with implication. My uncle suggested, in a roundabout way, that documentation could be misleading if not handled carefully, a statement intended to cast doubt on my integrity without directly accusing me. My aunt nodded slowly, eyes never leaving mine, a slight tightening of her jaw betraying the effort to maintain composure. I could feel every pulse of judgment aimed at me, like invisible arrows piercing my confidence. I reminded myself that this was a test of patience and perception. Months of caregiving had taught me how to handle crises quietly, how to remain composed in high-pressure situations, and how to anticipate reactions before they occurred. Every whisper, glance, and subtle gesture in this room was another opportunity to observe, to understand, and to prepare for the moment when the truth would finally surface. Even as the room continued its delicate dance of whispers and hidden agendas, I caught small glimpses of contradictions. A relative who had been vocally critical a moment ago hesitated when pressed by the lawyer. Another whispered instructions that contradicted earlier statements. These tiny inconsistencies became my allies, subtle clues that the orchestrated narrative had cracks. I noted them meticulously, silently filing each away for the moment when evidence would speak louder than whispers. The room's tension had been unbearable for hours. Every whispered comment, every subtle glance, and every veiled smile felt like it was designed to break me. But beneath the mounting pressure, a quiet sense of determination had started to take root. I had spent months observing, caring, and protecting my grandfather in ways no one else had noticed. Now it was time for proof. Proof that could not be denied. Proof that could not be twisted. Ms. Hargrove, the lawyer, finally cleared her throat, breaking the near-suffocating silence. Before we proceed with reading the full will, she said, her calm voice cutting through the tension, there is one item your grandfather wanted us to review specifically. It's documented as part of his instructions. She held up a small tablet, the screen blank for now, but promising the revelation of something long kept secret. My heart thudded in my chest. I recognized that device immediately. It was a memory card reader connected to the home security camera my grandfather had installed months earlier. At the time, he jokingly referred to it as his eye in the room, a way to ensure nothing disappeared and that he had some sense of control over the house he cherished. I had barely thought about it back then, but now it felt like a lifeline thrown to me at exactly the right moment. Callie, Ms. Hargrove said gently, your grandfather insisted this be reviewed in your presence first. He wanted you to understand the reasoning behind certain changes he made to the will. My stomach clenched. It wasn't just money at stake anymore. It was recognition, validation, and the long overdue exposure of months of hard, unnoticed work. I nodded silently, my fingers trembling slightly as I accepted the tablet. Everyone in the room watched me now. My aunt's gaze was sharp, like a predator assessing prey. My uncle leaned back, arms crossed, a smug expression that suggested he thought he already understood the narrative. And yet, despite their calculated stares, I felt a flicker of calm. The truth had been recorded, and now it would speak for itself. I tapped the screen, and the footage began. At first, it was mundane. My grandfather sitting in his favorite chair, reading the newspaper, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the familiar, lived-in furniture. Then I noticed the subtle movements, the interactions, the moments that mattered most. My eyes fixed on the screen as my breath slowed, each frame sharpening the tension in the room. The first moment that caught my attention was a figure entering the living room late one afternoon. It was my cousin, Jason. He moved cautiously, glancing around as if expecting someone to be watching, though at the time he could not have known he was being recorded. He approached the drawer, where my grandfather kept small sums of cash for everyday expenses. My fingers tightened around the tablet as I watched him rifle through the contents, sliding bills into his pocket with deliberate care. I could hear the faint whispers and gasps from the back of the room. Relatives who had been observing closely now seemed frozen, unable to fully process what they were seeing. My aunt's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening ever so slightly. The carefully constructed web of insinuations and whispers that had been aimed at me began to unravel in real time. The footage continued, each clip building the story that had been obscured for so long. Another relative, someone who had seemed neutral in the room, was captured moving items, hiding small valuables in obscure corners of the living room. Each act was deliberate, patient, and dishonest. The camera had observed everything silently, impartially, without judgment, exposing the subtle betrayals that had gone unnoticed or ignored. I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a twinge of sorrow. Relief, because my innocence would finally be acknowledged. Vindication, because the months of care I had given were finally validated. Sorrow, because it was shocking to see the lengths to which my relatives had gone to manipulate my grandfather and his estate, prioritizing greed over care and love. At one point, the camera captured a moment that broke my heart. The same cousin from earlier, seated in my grandfather's chair after taking the money, laughing quietly to himself. There was no remorse, no hesitation, only the selfish satisfaction of someone who believed they could act without consequence. I felt a wave of quiet anger, not violent or loud, but deep and controlled, the kind that sharpens the mind and prepares it for measured action. As the footage progressed, my grandfather appeared on screen, unaware of being recorded, but his trust in those around him was clear. He had left detailed instructions and warnings about his finances, clearly concerned about manipulation. Each clip revealed the contrast between my dedication and my relatives' opportunism. While I had been patiently caring for him, they had been scheming, sneaking, and undermining both him and me. I paused for a moment, letting the images settle in. The weight of it all hit me. The months of invisible labor, the nights spent at his bedside, the small gestures of care that no one acknowledged, now juxtaposed with the deliberate deceit of those who had accused me. I realized with a quiet intensity that the camera had become a symbol of justice. Not loud, not confrontational, but undeniable and irrefutable. Ms. Hargrove leaned forward. "Callie," she said, "your grandfather wanted this evidence to ensure that the right person was recognized. He trusted you more than anyone else." My throat tightened, and I nodded, unable to find words that would capture the flood of relief and validation. This was more than vindication. It was the moral acknowledgement I had longed for, now captured in moving images that could not be dismissed. The footage revealed small, telling moments beyond the theft itself. I saw my cousins arguing quietly, whispering and signaling to one another, plotting how to frame me as the guilty party. Their secret meetings, their stolen glances, even the careful placement of minor objects, they had all been designed to mislead, to create a narrative where I appeared manipulative. Yet here, captured unflinchingly by the camera, their efforts crumbled before my eyes. One clip showed my aunt subtly moving my grandfather's checkbook while he was reading, intending to later claim discrepancies as evidence against me. I felt my pulse quicken as I watched the motion, so small, so deliberate, yet entirely revealing. This simple, unnoticed act had been twisted in the room earlier into an accusation against me, highlighting the dangerous power of perception and insinuation. I could feel the room shifting as everyone watched the footage. My aunt's face paled slightly, her previous confidence faltering. My uncle's posture stiffened, and the subtle smirk that had hovered on his lips vanished. The whispers that had been meant to intimidate me now seemed hollow, meaningless in the presence of undeniable truth. For the first time in hours, I felt a sense of quiet power, not through confrontation, but through evidence that spoke louder than any accusation. Then, the final clip appeared, the most revealing of all. My grandfather, sitting quietly in his favorite chair, looked up at the camera with a soft smile, as if he knew it was all being recorded. He reached for my hand, the image faintly blurred in the low light, and whispered something I had heard many times but never realized would carry such weight. "Callie, I trust you. You always have, and you always will." The weight of that moment pressed down on me, both comforting and affirming. All the quiet nights, the careful attention to every detail of his care, every act of patience and love, they had been seen, even if not by the family, and even if not in ways I had ever realized. The camera had captured not only the wrongdoing of others, but also my unwavering dedication. I set the tablet down for a moment, letting the silence envelop the room. The tension that had pressed so heavily against me seemed to lift fractionally, replaced by a delicate, almost reverent quiet. I realized that the camera had done more than expose theft. It had revealed character. It had shown who had been present in meaningful ways, and who had only been chasing opportunity. Ms. Hargrove finally spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying a subtle edge of satisfaction. "I think the evidence is clear. Your grandfather made arrangements to protect what he valued, and he ensured that truth would be revealed. It seems he trusted you, Callie, and wisely so." I felt a tear escape, quickly brushed away, a quiet acknowledgement of the validation I had waited for. The family's reaction was immediate but varied. Some gasped audibly, covering their mouths with hands or shaking heads in disbelief. Others, like my aunt and cousin Jason, attempted to mask their shock with forced neutrality, but their eyes betrayed them, an unmistakable flicker of panic and discomfort. The room was irrevocably changed. The whispers and hidden agendas that had dominated the past hour now felt exposed, fragile, and meaningless. I realized then, fully and clearly, that justice had arrived quietly. It hadn't been loud, dramatic, or confrontational. It hadn't required shouting, anger, or humiliation. The camera, simple and unassuming, had told the story that no words or accusations could alter. It had captured truth with clarity, impartiality, and unflinching honesty. The room was still, but it was different now. The invisible weight of suspicion that had pressed down on me for hours had begun to lift, replaced by a quiet, almost surreal calm. The camera had done its work. It had revealed the truth with unflinching clarity, stripping away the layers of deception that my relatives had so carefully woven. And though the tension lingered faintly in the corners of the room, the fear in the eyes of those who had accused me was unmistakable. I realized in that moment that victory could be quiet, almost imperceptible, yet infinitely more satisfying than any loud confrontation. I looked around at the faces of my relatives, taking in their reactions. Some avoided my gaze, pretending to be indifferent, but I could see the flicker of guilt or unease in their eyes. Others were openly shocked, whispers passing between them as they tried to process what had just been revealed. My aunt's lips were pressed tightly together, her carefully maintained composure faltering ever so slightly. I felt no rush to speak, no need to celebrate. The camera had spoken for me, and its impartial testimony carried more weight than any words I could utter. Ms. Hargrove placed a reassuring hand on the tablet, her expression calm but knowing. "Your grandfather wanted everything to be transparent," she said softly, her voice cutting through the residual tension. "He trusted you, Callie, and it's clear that he made the right decision." The words were simple, yet they reverberated through me like a wave I had been waiting for. Months of doubt, hours of silent observation, years of unacknowledged care. It was all recognized at last. I felt the urge to stand, to move, to embrace the quiet triumph, but I held myself still. There was power in restraint, in allowing the room to absorb what had just unfolded. The camera had shown every action, every subtle attempt at manipulation, and now the narrative had shifted. It was no longer about me defending my integrity. It was about everyone else facing the truth of their choices. After a few minutes of tense silence, my grandmother spoke. Her voice was gentle but firm, carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "Callie, I've watched you with him for months," she said, eyes glistening with tears. "I saw your patience, your care, your unwavering presence. I didn't realize how much you did, how much you sacrificed. I'm sorry I doubted you." Her words, so quiet and sincere, filled a space in my heart that had been heavy with doubt. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. No apology could erase the past, but it was acknowledgement enough. The others remained silent, some staring at the tablet as though hoping to find an alternate version of reality hidden in its files. I could see the tension in my uncle's jaw, the sharp exhale from my cousin Lily, and the faint flicker of guilt in my aunt's eyes. They had assumed control, assumed that accusations alone could dictate the narrative. But evidence, patient and impartial, had overturned their assumptions. There was no confrontation, no shouting. It was quiet, undeniable, and irreversible. I thought back to the months I had spent caring for my grandfather, the invisible labor that had gone unnoticed by almost everyone, folding his laundry, arranging his favorite chair by the window, making his meals exactly as he liked them, sitting quietly with him when he couldn't sleep. These acts had all been small threads in a tapestry that, until now, felt invisible. Yet here, through the impartial lens of a camera, they were recognized. I realized that validation didn't always come from applause or recognition. It sometimes came silently, indirectly, through proof of one's integrity and dedication. As I absorbed the moment, I noticed a small incident that brought a faint, quiet smile to my face. My cousin Jason, who had been so confident in accusing me, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His hands trembled slightly as he fiddled with the cuff of his sleeve, and he avoided my gaze entirely. The subtle gestures were almost imperceptible, yet they spoke volumes. The veneer of superiority he had maintained for so long was cracking under the weight of truth, and I felt a quiet sense of justice in observing it. I realized that this quiet victory carried lessons beyond the immediate validation of my integrity. It was a lesson about patience, about observation, about the value of persistence, and care even when no one else noticed. I had spent months providing attention, empathy, and patience, virtues that had no immediate reward, but now yielded undeniable results. The camera had become more than a tool for proof. It had become a testament to the principle that integrity and dedication eventually reveal themselves, even when ignored or doubted. The lawyer's voice drew me back to the present. Callie, your grandfather left instructions regarding his estate. He wanted to ensure that his care, his wishes, and those he trusted were recognized. She gestured toward a stack of documents on the table. I felt a wave of anticipation, tempered by the quiet calm that had settled over me. This was not about greed. It was about fairness, acknowledgement, and respect for what had been earned through dedication. As the reading of the will began, I noticed the subtle shifts in the room. My grandmother watched me with warmth and pride, her hands folded gently in her lap. Lily's posture softened, a hint of admiration in her eyes, as she observed the recognition I was receiving. Even my aunt and uncle, though still maintaining polite neutrality, were visibly affected by the weight of proof that contradicted their earlier assertions. The camera had exposed more than theft. It had exposed attitudes, assumptions, and hidden motivations. I remembered a small, almost forgotten moment that my grandfather had shared months before his passing. Callie, he had said, his voice soft. Sometimes people don't see the effort behind the kindness, but that doesn't make it any less valuable. At the time, I had smiled politely, accepting the words, but not fully internalizing them. Now, as the camera validated every unseen action, I understood the depth of his statement. Recognition doesn't always come when it's expected. Sometimes it arrives quietly, indirectly, through moments of undeniable truth. A subtle twist emerged when one of the lesser-involved relatives, who had been silently observing, leaned forward with a faint smile. I didn't realize, she admitted quietly, how much Callie did. I had no idea it was this involved. Her acknowledgement, though understated, carried significance. Even in a room fraught with hidden agendas and whispered alliances, truth could reach and impact those willing to see it. I felt a quiet sense of relief, realizing that my efforts had influenced at least some of the people around me positively. As the will continued to be read, I reflected on the emotional journey that had brought me here. Months of invisible caregiving, subtle conflicts, and quiet perseverance had culminated in a moment of recognition that did not rely on anger or confrontation. The camera had ensured that truth was not subjective, that effort was not invisible, and that integrity could not be denied. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not one rooted in revenge, but in justice, fairness, and moral clarity. There were moments during the reading when my mind drifted to small, intimate memories with my grandfather. The evenings spent reading by the lamp's warm glow, the quiet laughter over shared jokes, the small gestures of gratitude he had offered in private, these memories, now validated through the camera, became a source of quiet strength, reminding me why I had persisted despite doubt, fatigue, and misunderstanding. Even the room's energy began to change. Whispers that had carried judgment and suspicion now seemed diminished, replaced by subtle acknowledgement and unease. I sensed a recalibration among my relatives, a recognition that honesty and integrity could not be undone by gossip or manipulation. The quiet victory was more powerful than confrontation because it forced reflection, internal reckoning, and a subtle acknowledgement of accountability. I remembered my grandfather's voice one last time, quiet and assured. Patience and care will always be noticed, Callie. Even when it seems invisible, it leaves a mark. Those words had lingered in my mind for months, but now they resonated fully. The mark he had spoken of was no longer invisible. It was undeniable, recorded, witnessed, and respected. And in that recognition, I found a sense of closure and peace that no accusation could ever remove. The final moments of the reading brought a sense of resolution. My grandfather had ensured that his wishes were clear, his trust in me validated, and the subtle acts of care I had provided were acknowledged indirectly through the proof of the camera. I felt a quiet smile tug at the corner of my lips, a mixture of relief, pride, and a deep emotional calm. Victory didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It was profound precisely because it was quiet, patient, and undeniable. After the lawyer concluded the reading, I stood slowly, taking in the room with a measured gaze. There was no triumphalism, no gloating, just a quiet confidence rooted in truth and integrity. My relatives looked at me differently now, some with newfound respect, others with reluctant acknowledgement of reality. I felt the invisible burden I had carried for months ease, replaced by a calm certainty that my efforts had mattered. As I walked out of the office later, the sun filtering gently through the windows, I reflected on the lessons this experience had imparted. Care, patience, and integrity are often unseen, but they carry weight. Subtle acts of dedication, even when unnoticed, shape outcomes and leave lasting impact. Quiet vigilance and persistence can overcome assumptions, whispers, and hidden agendas. And ultimately, truth, once revealed, has the power to change perceptions without anger or confrontation. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to release the tension that had tightened my shoulders for hours. The camera had told the truth, but more importantly, I had lived it. I had cared, persisted, and acted with integrity even when it seemed invisible. And now, as I stepped into the world beyond the lawyer's office, I carried with me a profound understanding. Quiet victories, rooted in patience and dedication, are often the most enduring and meaningful. As I stepped out of the lawyer's office, the late afternoon sun bathed the street in a warm, golden glow, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself breathe without restraint. The weight of suspicion, the whispers, the judging eyes, they had all been stripped away by truth, patient, and unflinching, recorded in silent, undeniable clarity. I felt lighter, not because I had won in the conventional sense, but because the months of invisible labor, the quiet care I had offered my grandfather, the nights of vigilance and patience, they had been acknowledged, even if indirectly. The camera had done more than reveal wrongdoing. It had illuminated character. My actions, my integrity, my dedication, they could no longer be dismissed or twisted to suit someone else's narrative. And in that quiet recognition, I felt a profound sense of peace settle deep within me. I thought about my grandfather and the trust he had placed in me, his gentle words, the soft squeeze of my hand, the subtle smiles he had offered in private moments. Those memories now resonated differently. They were proof, not just of his affection, but of the bond we had shared, a bond built on care, presence, and unwavering loyalty. I realized then that victory was never about proving others wrong. It was about staying true to yourself, remaining steadfast even when no one is watching, and knowing that your values carry weight beyond immediate recognition. The camera had captured what others had overlooked, but more importantly, I had lived it, breathed it, and embodied it every day. That truth, internal and external, was unshakable. As I walked down the quiet street, the murmurs of family disputes and hidden agendas faded in my mind, replaced by clarity. The lessons I had learned were profound and enduring. Integrity is quiet but powerful, patience is often invisible but transformative, and acts of care, no matter how small or unnoticed, leave lasting impact. I understood now that life is not always about confrontation or dramatic vindication. Sometimes the most meaningful victories are the ones that are quiet, patient, and lived with dignity. I had been invisible, underestimated, and even accused, yet I emerged with something no accusation could ever take away, a sense of self-worth rooted in truth and resilience. I thought about the future, about how I would carry these lessons forward. I would continue to honor my grandfather's memory, not just in the inheritance I received, but in the way I treated others, the way I approached challenges, and the quiet vigilance with which I lived my life. And perhaps one day, someone else would benefit from patience, care, and unwavering dedication, even when unrecognized. That, I realized, was the greatest legacy of all. For the first time in a long time, I smiled without reservation, feeling the calm of quiet victory settle deep into my bones. I had survived the accusations, navigated the hidden agendas, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more certain of who I was. And in that certainty, I found not just closure, but a profound, lasting peace that no whisper, no deception, and no shadow of doubt could ever touch.